Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Imagine your own father telling you your wedding isn't worth his time, refusing to stand by your side on one of the most important days of your life. Years later, when he's in desperate need, he expects your help like nothing ever happened. Do you forgive and move on, or finally stand up for yourself? The moment I got engaged, I knew exactly what kind of wedding I wanted. Simple, intimate, and meaningful. My fiancé, Luke, and I had always been practical people. Neither of us saw the point in spending tens of thousands of dollars on a single day when we could invest that money into our future together. So, we settled on a small ceremony with only our closest friends and family, followed by a backyard reception at my childhood home. It wasn't extravagant, but it was ours. When I told my dad, his reaction was exactly what I had feared. A backyard wedding? He repeated, his face twisted into a look of disdain. You're serious? I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. Yeah. We don't want anything too big. It's about the marriage, not the party. My dad leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. Weddings are supposed to be grand, he said. People talk about them for years. You're going to regret this, you know? Nobody remembers a small wedding. What's the point if you're not even going to do it right? I forced a smile, swallowing the sting of his words. This wasn't the first time my dad had made me feel like my choices weren't good enough. Growing up, he was always more concerned with appearances than with substance. Everything had to look perfect from the outside, even if it wasn't. But this was my wedding, and I wasn't about to let him dictate how it should be. It'll be beautiful, I said, more to convince myself than him. You'll see. But his disapproval didn't stop there. Over the weeks leading up to the wedding, he found every opportunity to remind me of how unimpressed he was. At family dinners, he'd make offhand comments about how real weddings should have banquet halls and live bands. When I mentioned that Luke and I were writing our own vows, he scoffed and said, "What's wrong with tradition?" It was exhausting, but I tried to brush it off. My mom, ever the peacemaker, assured me that he'd come around. He just has his opinions, she said one evening as we went over the seating chart. But deep down, he's proud of you. He'll be there for you on the big day. Don't worry. I wanted to believe her. But as the wedding date approached, my dad's attitude only got worse. He started avoiding conversations about the wedding altogether, and when I tried to show him the final guest list or the flower arrangements, he waved me off with a dismissive, "Do whatever you want." The final blow came 2 weeks before the wedding. I was sitting in my parents' living room, going over some last-minute details with my mom, when my dad walked in. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and cleared his throat. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone neutral but his words sharp. "I'm not going to walk you down the aisle." The room went silent. My mom looked up from her notebook, her eyes wide. "What are you talking about?" she asked. My dad shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "If you're not going to put in the effort to have a real wedding, why should I bother?" His words hit me like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stared at him, hoping I'd misheard, that he'd realize how cruel he sounded and take it back. But he just stood there, his expression cold and unyielding. "Dad," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It's not about how big the wedding is. It's about the people who are there. I want you to be a part of it." He shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I can't support this. It's not what I envisioned for you. If you want to do things your way, that's fine, but don't expect me to be involved." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I refused to let him see me cry. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If that's how you feel, then don't come." He didn't respond, just turned and walked out of the room. My mom reached over to place a comforting hand on mine, but it didn't help. The damage was done. That night, I cried myself to sleep, replaying his words over and over in my head. I couldn't understand how my own father could be so dismissive of one of the most important days of my life. But as hurt as I was, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let his absence ruin my wedding. On the day of the ceremony, I walked myself down the aisle. My mom had offered to do it, but I declined. I wanted to prove, to him and to myself, that I didn't need him to make my day special. As I took those steps toward Luke, the guests turned to look at me, some with smiles, others with confusion. I held my head high, ignoring the empty chair where my dad was supposed to be. The ceremony was beautiful. Luke and I exchanged our vows under the same tree I used to climb as a child, surrounded by people who truly cared about us. The reception was filled with laughter, music, and warmth. It was everything I had hoped for, even with the dark cloud of my dad's absence hanging over me. But as the night wound down, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what had happened. My wedding had been perfect in so many ways, but the one person who was supposed to be there for me had chosen not to be. And no matter how much I tried to focus on the joy of the day, the hurt lingered, a sharp reminder of just how deeply my dad's approval, or lack of it, had shaped my life. My wedding day was everything I had imagined, and nothing like I had imagined, all at once. The morning dawned with a kind of stillness that felt surreal, as if the world had pressed pause just for me. Luke and I had planned every detail to reflect who we were as a couple. No grand ballroom, no elaborate decor, just a simple ceremony under the big oak tree in my parents' backyard. It was the same tree I used to climb as a kid, the one that had been a constant in my life when everything else seemed to change. But as I stood in my childhood bedroom, staring at my reflection in the full-length mirror, all I could think about was the empty chair at the ceremony. My dad's absence was like a gaping hole in the day, one I couldn't ignore no matter how hard I tried. My mom knocked softly before coming in, her face a mixture of pride and worry. "You look beautiful," she said, her voice warm. "Thanks, Mom," I said, forcing a smile. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, smoothing the lace on my dress. "Are you sure you don't want me to walk you down the aisle?" I shook my head. "I appreciate it, but I need to do this on my own." Her eyes softened, and she gave my hand a squeeze. "You're stronger than you think, sweetheart. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Her words gave me the courage I needed, but as I stood at the edge of the aisle, the weight of the moment hit me like a tidal wave. The soft hum of conversation among the guests quieted as the music began to play, and all eyes turned toward me. For a split second, I wanted to run, but then I saw Luke standing at the altar, his smile steady and reassuring, and it was like everything else faded away. I took a deep breath and began walking. Each step felt heavier than the last, but I kept my chin up, refusing to let the tears in my eyes fall. The guests whispered as I passed, their expressions a mixture of confusion and sympathy. I could practically hear the unspoken questions. Why is she walking alone? Where's her dad? When I finally reached the altar, Luke took my hand, his touch grounding me. "You're amazing," he whispered, his voice so soft only I could hear. The ceremony was beautiful, exactly as we had planned. We exchanged vows under the shade of the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through the leaves like a blessing. My best friend officiated, weaving personal anecdotes into the ceremony that made everyone laugh and cry. For a moment, I allowed myself to forget about the empty chair and focus on the love that surrounded me. But as the ceremony ended and the guests began to move toward the reception area, reality crept back in. My dad's absence hung over me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the hurt he had caused. The reception was a mix of laughter and bittersweet moments. The backyard was transformed into a cozy celebration space, with string lights hanging from the trees and long tables filled with wildflowers. Our friends and family danced, toasted, and filled the air with joy. Yet, as much as I wanted to join in, I couldn't shake the nagging thoughts in the back of my mind. Every time someone congratulated me, I half expected them to bring up my dad. Every time I saw an older man dancing with his daughter or making a toast, it felt like a knife twisting in my chest. At one point, my aunt pulled me aside, her expression full of sympathy. "You handled everything so gracefully today," she said. "I know your dad would be proud of you, even if he doesn't show it." Her words were meant to comfort me, but they only made the ache worse. Proud? He couldn't even bother to show up. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the last of the guests left, I found myself sitting alone under the oak tree, staring at the now empty reception area. Luke found me there, a bottle of champagne in hand and a concerned look on his face. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. "It was a perfect day," I said finally. "But I can't stop thinking about him." Luke didn't need me to elaborate. He put an arm around me, pulling me close. "It's his loss," he said firmly. "He missed out on an incredible day and an incredible daughter." His words brought tears to my eyes, but this time, I let them fall. The love I felt from Luke was enough to remind me that, no matter what my dad thought, I had built a life filled with people who truly cared about me. The wedding had been a mix of joy and heartbreak, a day I would never forget for all the right and wrong reasons. And while I told myself that I had made the right choice by not letting my dad's absence ruin the day, I knew the hurt would linger for a long time. As Luke and I walked back to the house, hand in hand, I made a silent promise to myself. I wouldn't let my dad's actions define me. I had married the love of my life and celebrated with people who mattered most. That was enough, or so I thought. After the wedding, the emotional distance between my dad and me grew like an invisible wall. I didn't cut him out of my life entirely, but the connection we once had felt fractured beyond repair. At first, I tried to keep things cordial. I call him occasionally, update him on my job or something funny that had happened, and ask how he was doing. He responded politely, but never enthusiastically, his tone always distant. Conversations with my dad became predictable, almost robotic. "How's work?" he'd ask, his voice flat. I'd tell him about a new project or a promotion, but his reaction was always the same, a vague, "that's nice," before he shifted the subject to something impersonal, like the weather or the latest sports scores. It wasn't just that he didn't acknowledge the hurt he'd caused by skipping my wedding. It was that he acted like it had never happened. Not once did he bring it up, apologize, or try to explain himself. He simply swept it under the rug, pretending as if his absence on one of the most important days of my life was a non-issue. At first, I hoped he was just waiting for the right time to talk about it. Maybe he felt guilty and didn't know how to approach the subject. But as the months turned into years, it became clear that wasn't the case. My dad wasn't avoiding the conversation because he felt bad. He was avoiding it because, in his mind, it wasn't worth addressing. I'll admit I stopped putting in as much effort after a while. It wasn't a conscious decision. It just sort of happened. The calls became less frequent, and when we did talk, it was only because I initiated it. I started to realize I was the one holding on to the idea of fixing things, while my dad seemed perfectly content with the surface-level relationship we had. The wedge between us widened with every passing year. I thought about bringing up the wedding and confronting him about how much his absence had hurt me, but every time I considered it, I talked myself out of it. What was the point? He'd already shown me that he didn't care, so why reopen old wounds? Luke was my sounding board during those years, always ready to listen when I needed to vent. "You don't owe him anything," he'd remind me when I felt guilty about the distance. "You've done more than enough. It's not your job to fix this." He was right, of course, but no matter how much I tried to move on, a small part of me still craved my dad's approval. That's the thing about parents. Even when they let you down, you still hope, deep down, that one day they'll see you, really see you, and be proud of who you've become. The turning point came during a family gathering a few years after the wedding. It was a holiday dinner, one of the few times my dad and I were in the same room. The atmosphere was festive, with laughter and chatter filling the air. But every time I looked across the table at him, I felt a pang of sadness. At one point, my mom pulled me aside in the kitchen. "You should talk to him," she said quietly, glancing toward my dad. "It's been long enough. Maybe it's time to let it go." "Let it go," I repeated, my voice sharper than I intended. "Mom, he's the one who walked away, not me. He's the one who should be making an effort." She sighed, her expression weary. "I know, sweetheart, but life's too short to hold on to grudges. He's your father." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the evening, but they didn't change how I felt. When it came time to leave, I gave my dad a polite hug and said goodbye, just like I always did. But as I walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man I once looked up to was now little more than a stranger. In the years that followed, I focused on building a life that made me happy. My career flourished, and Luke and I created a home filled with love and laughter. We talked about starting a family, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was in control of my own happiness. My dad, meanwhile, became a peripheral figure, a name in my phone, a face at the occasional family gathering, a distant presence that no longer held the weight it once did. I stopped expecting him to change, stopped hoping for the apology that would never come. It wasn't ideal, but it was easier than reopening old wounds. Looking back, I realize now that I had put my dad on a pedestal for most of my life, believing that his approval was something I needed to truly feel validated. But as time went on, I learned to find that validation within myself. I didn't need him to walk me down the aisle, to praise my accomplishments, or to be the father I always wanted him to be. Or at least, that's what I told myself. The rain was pounding against the windows that Tuesday afternoon, a constant rhythm that usually soothed me on slow days. I was sitting at my desk, halfway through an email for work, when my phone buzzed beside me. Glancing at the screen, I saw my dad's name flash across it. I froze. It wasn't that I never heard from him. We exchanged the occasional text or polite phone call, but it was rare for him to call me out of the blue. My first thought was that something had happened to my mom, but then I remembered she had mentioned visiting her sister that week. That left one possibility. This call wasn't going to be casual. After a moment of hesitation, I answered. "Hey," I said cautiously, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Hey," he replied, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. There was a pause on his end, the kind that felt heavy with meaning. "I need to talk to you," he said finally. "It's serious?" My heart sank. "What's going on?" He sighed, a sound so laden with weariness that it immediately set me on edge. "I've been sick," he said quietly. "The doctors say it's serious." I didn't know how to respond. My dad wasn't the kind of person who talked about his health, much less admitted to being vulnerable. The thought of him being genuinely ill felt surreal, like trying to imagine the sky without clouds. "What do you mean, serious?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's cancer," he said, the word hanging in the air like a thunderclap. "Stage 3. I felt my stomach drop. "Cancer." The word carried a weight I wasn't prepared for, a sense of impending loss that I hadn't expected to feel. Despite everything, the wedding, the years of distance, the countless disappointments, he was still my dad. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice breaking. What do you need from me?" That's when he got to the real reason for the call. "The treatments are expensive," he said, his tone almost pleading. "I've got insurance, but it barely covers anything. I've been trying to manage, but the bills keep piling up. I wouldn't ask if I didn't need it. But you're the only one who can help me." His words hit me like a tidal wave. The man who had refused to walk me down the aisle because my wedding wasn't big enough was now asking me for financial help. He hadn't apologized for the pain he'd caused me. He hadn't tried to repair the relationship he'd fractured. And yet, here he was, expecting me to step in and save him. For a moment, I didn't say anything. My mind raced with 1,000 conflicting thoughts and emotions. On one hand, this was my dad. No matter how strained our relationship had become, I didn't want to see him suffer. But on the other hand, the audacity of his request left me stunned. Did he really think he could just call me up after years of neglect and expect me to fix everything? "Why me?" I asked finally, my voice trembling. He hesitated, as if the question had caught him off guard. "You're the only one I can turn to," he said. "I know we've had our differences, but you've always been responsible. I can count on you." The irony of his words stung. Responsible. It was the same word he'd used to justify missing my wedding. He had counted on me to bounce back from his absence, to keep things together while he refused to show up. And now, he was counting on me again, to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I need to think about it." His tone grew more desperate. "Please don't take too long," he said. "I don't have time to wait." I ended the call soon after, promising to get back to him in a few days. But as I sat there, staring at the rain streaking down the window, I felt completely adrift. When Luke came home that evening, I told him everything. He listened patiently as I recounted the call, his expression a mixture of sympathy and concern. "What are you going to do?" he asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "Part of me feels like I should help him. He's my dad, after all. But another part of me feels like, why should I? He's never been there for me. Why should I be there for him now?" Luke nodded, his brow furrowed in thought. "It's a tough situation," he said. "But whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with. Don't let guilt force you into a decision you're not comfortable with." His words stayed with me over the next few days as I tried to sort through my feelings. I thought about the wedding, the years of distance, the countless times my dad had put his own pride and ego above our relationship. I thought about how he had never apologized, never tried to make things right. And now, when he was in trouble, he was reaching out like nothing had ever happened. But I also thought about the weight of regret. If I turned my back on him now, would I regret it someday? Would I carry the guilt of knowing I could have helped him and chose not to? The decision felt impossible, a no-win situation, no matter how I looked at it. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about everything my dad and I had left unsaid, everything we'd avoided addressing for years. And whether I chose to help him or not, I knew the conversation we'd been avoiding for so long was finally coming. As I sat in silence after my dad's call, his voice still echoing in my head, memories I had buried for years began to resurface. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. The hurt that had lingered quietly in the corners of my mind suddenly came flooding back, filling every empty space with moments I had tried to forget. The wedding was just the tip of the iceberg. I thought back to all the times my dad had let me down, each memory a reminder of how one-sided our relationship had always been. When I was 8 and desperately wanted him to come to my school play, he promised he'd be there. I spent the whole performance scanning the audience, hoping to see his face, but the seat next to my mom stayed empty. He showed up hours later with a vague excuse about work running late, brushing it off like it didn't matter. Then there was the time in high school when I spent weeks preparing for a big science competition. I had built a detailed project, pouring my heart into every little detail, and I asked him if he could take the day off to watch me present it. "We'll see," he had said, a phrase I'd come to hate because it almost always meant no. The day of the competition, he didn't even bother to call. It wasn't just the missed events that stung. It was the way he treated my accomplishments as if they were never quite good enough. When I got into my first choice college, his response wasn't pride or excitement. "How much is that going to cost?" he had asked, his tone laced with skepticism. I worked 2 part-time jobs to cover expenses, and even though he contributed a little, it always came with a lecture about responsibility, as if my ambition was something to be tolerated rather than celebrated. As an adult, I had learned to keep my expectations low. My dad was the kind of person who showed up when it suited him, not when it mattered most. When my car broke down during a particularly rough winter, I called him for help, hoping he might lend a hand or at least some advice. Instead, he told me to figure it out and hung up. Moments like that became the norm, a pattern of taking and dismissing that left me feeling small and unimportant. And now, here he was, asking for help as if none of that mattered. It wasn't just the audacity of the request. It was the way he had framed it, like I was his only hope, the one person who could save him. I felt like a tool he reached for in times of need, not a daughter he truly cared about. I wanted to slam the door shut, to let all the resentment I'd buried over the years spill out in a flood of anger. But there was another part of me, smaller and quieter, that couldn't ignore the flicker of longing I still felt. No matter how many times he had let me down, some part of me still craved his approval, his acknowledgement, his love. "Why can't I just let it go?" I said aloud, my voice breaking the silence of the room. Luke looked up from across the table, his expression soft but serious. "Because he's your dad," he said simply. "It's not easy to let go of someone you've been hoping will change your whole life." His words hit me hard. He wasn't wrong. I had spent years hoping my dad would wake up one day and realize how much he had hurt me. Every birthday, every holiday, every rare conversation was tinged with the quiet hope that this time would be different, that this time he'd see me for who I was and not just for what I could do for him. But that day had never come. And now, with his health failing and his back against the wall, he was finally reaching out, not to repair the damage he had caused, but because he needed something from me. "It's always been like this," I said, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "He only shows up when he needs something. He's never been there for me, but now he expects me to drop everything and save him." Luke reached across the table and took my hand. "You don't have to do this," he said gently. "You don't owe him anything." "I know," I said, though the words felt hollow. "But what kind of person does that make me if I don't help him? What if he doesn't survive this? What if I regret not doing something?" Luke sighed, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. "Only you can answer that," he said. "But whatever you decide, make sure it's your choice. Not his guilt or your past trying to dictate what you do." The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I tried to focus on work, on anything that would distract me from the weight of the decision hanging over me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memories. I thought about the countless times I had needed him, only to be met with excuses or indifference. I thought about how many milestones he had missed, how many moments he had dismissed as unimportant. And yet, I also thought about the good times, the rare moments when he had made me laugh, the fleeting glimpses of the father I had always wanted him to be. Those memories made it harder to decide. Was I holding on to anger that I should let go of, or was I finally standing up for myself after years of being taken for granted? Was helping him an act of compassion, or would it only reinforce the pattern of him taking and me giving? As the deadline to give him an answer loomed closer, I found myself pacing the kitchen late at night, replaying every conversation, every memory, every justification I could think of. The little girl inside me wanted to help him, to believe that this time would be different. But the woman I had become knew better. That evening, as the sky outside dimmed into twilight, I sat across from Luke at the dining table, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. He had always been my rock, the steady voice of reason when my emotions threatened to overwhelm me. But even as I laid out the situation, I could see the hesitation in his eyes. "I just don't know what to do," I said, my voice raw. "Every time I think about helping him, I feel sick. But when I think about not helping him, I feel guilty. I can't win either way." Luke reached for my hand, his thumb brushing against my skin in a comforting rhythm. "Let's talk it through," he said. "No pressure, no judgment. Just figure out what feels right to you." His words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they didn't make the decision any easier. Do you really think helping him is the right thing to do? He asked after a moment, his tone gentle but probing. After everything he's put you through? I stared at the table, tracing the wood grain with my eyes. I don't know, I admitted. It feels wrong to turn my back on him, but at the same time, I don't know if I can forgive him for what he did. Luke nodded, his expression thoughtful. You don't have to forgive him to make a decision, he said. But you do need to figure out what's driving your choice. Are you helping him because you want to, or because you feel like you have to? That question stuck with me. I wanted to believe I could separate my emotions from the situation, but the truth was far more complicated. I wasn't just deciding whether to help my dad with his medical bills. I was deciding whether I could live with myself if I didn't. We went back and forth for what felt like hours, weighing every possible outcome. If I help him, what's to stop him from taking advantage of me again? I asked at one point, my frustration bubbling to the surface. What if this is just another way for him to use me? That's a valid fear, Luke said. But ask yourself this. If you don't help him, will you regret it? Will it haunt you, knowing you could have done something but chose not to? His words hit me hard, forcing me to confront a question I'd been avoiding. Would I regret walking away? Would I spend the rest of my life wondering if I had made the wrong choice? But the flip side of that question was just as important. If I did help him, would it actually change anything? Would it fix our relationship? Or would it only reinforce the pattern of him taking and me giving? I just don't want to make a mistake, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. There's no perfect choice here, Luke said, his tone reassuring. Whatever you decide, you'll have to live with it. The question is, which choice will give you the most peace? The word peace felt like a lifeline, something I hadn't considered in the chaos of my emotions. What would give me peace? Turning my back on my dad felt cold and unforgiving, but helping him felt like opening myself up to more pain. Either way, I would lose something, either my sense of self-protection or whatever was left of my relationship with him. Luke's support meant the world to me, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted to back my decision no matter what, but I knew he struggled with the idea of me helping someone who had hurt me so deeply. You're the most generous person I know, he said softly. But that doesn't mean you have to be a doormat. It's okay to say no, even to family. The word no lingered in the air like a forbidden fruit. It was so simple, yet so loaded with meaning. Saying no would mean standing up for myself, drawing a line in the sand that my dad could never cross again. But it would also mean closing a door that might never reopen. The night stretched on, the hours slipping away as we turned the issue over and over, examining it from every angle. At one point, I stood by the window, staring out at the streetlights glowing faintly in the rain. The sound of water on the glass mirrored the storm inside me, a constant push and pull that left me exhausted. I hate that I'm even in this position, I said, my voice trembling. I hate that he's put me here. I know, Luke said, wrapping his arms around me from behind. You didn't ask for this. But whatever you decide, I'll support you. Just promise me one thing. What? Don't make this decision out of guilt, he said firmly. Make it because it's what you want to do, not because you feel like you have to. His words gave me the clarity I needed, but they didn't make the choice any easier. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I tried to picture each scenario in my mind. What would it feel like to say yes? To help him? To put aside my anger and do what he was asking? And what would it feel like to say no? To walk away and let him deal with the consequences of his own choices? Neither option felt right, but I knew I couldn't put off the decision forever. My dad's medical bills weren't going to wait, and neither was he. In the end, I realized that the answer wasn't just about him. It was about me, about what I needed to feel at peace with myself. And while I still didn't have a clear answer, I knew one thing for sure. Whatever choice I made, it had to be my own. It took me days to work up the courage to call my dad back. The decision I had made was clear in my mind, but delivering it to him was another matter entirely. I rehearsed the conversation in my head over and over, bracing myself for the inevitable pushback. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about finally addressing everything we had left unsaid for years. When I finally dialed his number, my heart pounded in my chest as I waited for him to pick up. On the third ring, he answered. Hey, he said, his tone cautious, almost tentative. Hey, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. I've been thinking about what you asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear him holding his breath. And I'm willing to help, I said, my words slow and deliberate. But I have some conditions. Conditions? He repeated, his tone immediately defensive. What kind of conditions? I took a deep breath, gripping the phone tightly. I'll cover part of your bills, I said, but only if we have an honest conversation about what happened at my wedding and everything that's happened since. There was a long silence, so long that I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. Why does that matter now? That was years ago. It matters because it's still affecting us, I said firmly. You can't just pretend it didn't happen, Dad. If you want my help, I need to know you're willing to take responsibility for how you've treated me. His tone turned defensive. I don't see how that has anything to do with this. I'm sick, and I need your help. Can't we just focus on that? I closed my eyes, trying to keep my frustration in check. That's the problem, Dad. You've always expected me to just move on, to ignore how much you've hurt me because it's more convenient for you. But I can't do that anymore. If you want my help, you need to meet me halfway. He sighed heavily, the sound crackling through the phone like static. What do you want me to say? He asked, his tone tinged with exasperation. That I'm sorry? Fine. I'm sorry, okay. It wasn't the apology I had hoped for. It felt rushed, hollow, more about appeasing me than actually addressing the hurt he had caused. But I pushed for it anyway. It's not just about saying sorry, I said. It's about understanding why what you did hurt me so much. Do you even know why I've been so distant all these years? I assumed it was because of the wedding, he said, his tone clipped. You've been holding on to that for way too long, by the way. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. His words stung, but they didn't surprise me. It wasn't just the wedding, Dad, I said. It was everything leading up to it. Every time you dismissed me. Every time you put your pride or your opinions above my feelings. The wedding was just a breaking point. Well, I'm sorry if you feel that way, he said, his voice growing defensive again. But I've always tried to do my best. I can't help it if it wasn't enough for you. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of anger and sadness bubbling to the surface. That's not the point, Dad, I said, my voice trembling. This isn't about whether you think you did your best. It's about the fact that you've never once acknowledged how your actions have affected me. There was another long pause, and for a moment, I wondered if I had pushed too far. But then he spoke, his voice quieter this time. I didn't realize you felt that way, he said. I guess I've always been focused on other things. But that doesn't mean I didn't care. His words were a small step, a crack in the wall he had built around himself. It wasn't the full accountability I had hoped for, but it was something. I need you to care now, I said softly, because I can't keep giving without anything in return. If you want my help, I need to know that you're willing to work on this, that you're willing to work on us. He didn't answer right away, and I could hear the tension in his breathing. I'll try, he said finally. I can't promise I'll get it right, but I'll try. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was enough for me to move forward. Okay, I said, my voice steady. I'll help with the bills. But this isn't just about money, Dad. This is about rebuilding trust. If you want a real relationship with me, it has to start here. He agreed, though I could tell he was still reluctant. Part of me wanted to push him further, to demand more, but I knew I couldn't force him to change overnight. This was a first step, a small one, but a step nonetheless. When I hung up the phone, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Setting boundaries with my dad had been one of the hardest things I'd ever done, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had taken control of our relationship. Whether he would follow through on his promises remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. I was no longer the same person who had walked down the aisle alone all those years ago. I had found my voice, and I wasn't afraid to use it. When my dad finally agreed to have a real conversation, I braced myself for what I hoped would be a turning point. Maybe this time he'd listen. Maybe he'd see how much his actions had hurt me and finally take responsibility. A part of me, small but stubborn, clung to the hope that this talk could be the start of something better. We met over the phone at his insistence. It's easier this way, he had said, brushing off my suggestion to meet in person. I wasn't surprised. My dad had always been more comfortable keeping emotional distance. Still, I agreed, hoping that the medium wouldn't diminish the message. Okay, I began after we exchanged the obligatory pleasantries. You said you were willing to talk, so let's talk. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the faint sound of him clearing his throat. Look, he said finally, his tone already defensive. I know you're upset about the wedding. I didn't mean to hurt you, but I thought you'd understand where I was coming from. I felt a sharp pang of disappointment. This wasn't an apology. It was a justification. Understand what, exactly? I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. He sighed heavily, as though I was the one being difficult. I had a lot going on back then. Work was stressful, money was tight, and I was dealing with my own stuff. It wasn't about you, okay? I just couldn't handle it at the time. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Dad, I said, Do you realize it's not an apology? You're making excuses, but you're not actually taking responsibility for what you did. What do you want me to say? He snapped, his frustration bubbling to the surface. I said I didn't mean to hurt you. Isn't that enough? No, I said firmly. It's not enough. Because it's not just about the wedding, it's about everything. You've spent years dismissing my feelings, acting like your priorities were the only ones that mattered. And now, when I'm asking you to take accountability, all you're doing is deflecting. There was another silence, this one heavier than the first. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost reluctant. I don't know what you want from me, he said. I want you to acknowledge how your actions have affected me, I replied. I want you to understand that saying, I didn't mean to hurt you, isn't the same as apologizing. Intent doesn't erase impact, Dad. He let out another sigh, the sound grating against my nerves. Fine, he said. I'm sorry. I should have been there for you. I should have walked you down the aisle. Is that what you wanted to hear? The words hung in the air, empty and weightless. His tone was clipped, almost dismissive, and it was clear that he didn't truly understand, or maybe he didn't want to understand, why his absence had hurt so much. No, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. What I wanted was for you to care enough to show up in the first place. And now I want you to mean it when you say you're sorry, not just say it because you think it's what I want to hear. He was silent again, and for a moment, I thought he might finally get it. But then he spoke, and any hope I'd had was dashed. I've already said I'm sorry, he said, his tone edging toward impatience. I don't know what else you expect me to do. What I expect, I said, my voice trembling, is for you to stop making this about you. Stop trying to justify your actions, and just acknowledge how they've affected me. That's what accountability looks like, Dad. Not excuses. Not deflections. Just honesty. There was a long pause, and when he finally responded, his tone was more resigned than anything else. I hear you, he said. I don't know if I can change the past, but I hear you. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. Still, it wasn't enough to erase the years of hurt or to make me feel like this conversation had truly moved the needle. I've spent years trying to understand where you were coming from, I said, my voice softer now. But understanding doesn't fix the damage. What I need now is for you to understand where I'm coming from, for you to acknowledge the pain you've caused and take steps to rebuild our relationship. That's the only way this can work. I'll try, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. I'll try to do better. It wasn't the resolution I had hoped for, but it was all I was going to get. When we ended the call, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the conversation was over, frustration at how little progress had been made, and a lingering sadness that my dad might never truly understand the depth of what he had done. As I sat there, staring at the phone in my hand, I realized that this wasn't the end of our story. It was just another chapter. Whether the next one would be better or worse was still unclear, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing my own well-being for the sake of a relationship that only existed on his terms. In the days following my conversation with my dad, I found myself grappling with an unrelenting internal conflict. Helping him felt like the right thing to do on the surface. He was my dad, after all, but it was impossible to ignore the emotional toll it was taking on me. I couldn't shake the hollow feeling left by his apology, or the sense that his need for help wasn't about mending our relationship, but about convenience. Still, I knew the stakes were high. My dad wasn't exaggerating about his medical bills. They were astronomical. Chemotherapy, radiation, endless rounds of scans, medications, and follow-ups had left him drowning in debt. The reality of his situation tugged at my heartstrings, no matter how much I wanted to harden myself against it. Luke had been a constant source of support throughout the ordeal, but even he could see the toll it was taking on me. Whatever you decide, I'm with you, he reminded me one evening as we sat on the couch, a quiet tension hanging between us. But don't forget to take care of yourself in the process. You've worked so hard to get where you are, you shouldn't have to jeopardize that. He was right. Over the years, I had built a stable life, piece by piece, often in spite of my dad's lack of support. My emergency savings, carefully tucked away for unexpected crises, was the product of years of discipline and sacrifice. The thought of watching it dwindle to help someone who had let me down so many times was a bitter pill to swallow. But the idea of doing nothing felt just as unbearable. No matter how strained our relationship was, the thought of my dad facing this alone filled me with guilt. Was it really my responsibility to save him? No. But was I willing to walk away knowing I could help? Even in a small way? That question lingered in my mind, unshakable. After several sleepless nights and countless conversations with Luke, I came to a decision. I would help, but only to a point. I would contribute enough to ease his burden without sacrificing my own financial stability. It was the best compromise I could make, a way to honor my values without losing myself in the process. When I called my dad to tell him, he sounded relieved, almost giddy. "Thank you," he said, his voice lighter than I'd heard it in weeks. "I knew you'd come through for me." His words stung more than I expected. They felt less like gratitude and more like an assumption, as if my help had been a foregone conclusion all along. I pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the boundaries I had set for myself. "Dad," I said firmly, "this isn't an open-ended arrangement. I'll pay for a portion of the bills, but that's it. I need you to understand that." "Of course," he said quickly. "I'm just grateful for anything you can do." "I mean it." His tone softened me slightly, but it didn't erase the doubts still gnawing at me. Even as I transferred the money to his account, I couldn't stop second-guessing myself. Was I enabling him? Was I setting myself up for more disappointment down the road? Or was I simply doing the best I could in an impossible situation? Over the next few weeks, I checked in with him periodically to see how he was doing. Our conversations were polite but distant, the emotional gap between us still unbridgeable. He updated me on his treatments, occasionally mentioning the financial relief my contribution had provided, but he never brought up our strained relationship or made any effort to mend it. At one point, I asked him how he was managing the rest of the bills. "I'm working on it," he said vaguely, "trying to figure things out." I wanted to press him for specifics, but I stopped myself. It wasn't my job to fix everything for him, and I had already done more than enough. Helping him hadn't magically repaired our relationship or erased the hurt he had caused, but it had given me a sense of closure. I had made a choice I could live with, one that balanced compassion with self-preservation. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control of my relationship with my dad, rather than being controlled by his actions or expectations. But that didn't mean it was easy. There were moments when I wondered if I had made the right call, moments when the weight of our history threatened to pull me under. Every time I thought about the money I had spent, the nagging question crept back in. Was it worth it? The answer wasn't clear, and maybe it never would be. But as I sat with Luke one evening, sipping tea and reflecting on the past few weeks, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my dad. It was about me, about learning to set boundaries, about choosing my own well-being over guilt, and about finding a way to move forward without losing myself in the process. "I'm proud of you," Luke said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "You made a tough decision, but you did it on your terms. That's not easy." His words brought tears to my eyes, a mix of relief and validation washing over me. For so long, I had carried the weight of my dad's expectations, always trying to prove myself to someone who never seemed to see me. But now, for the first time, I felt like I was enough, just as I was. My decision to help my dad wasn't perfect, and it didn't fix everything. But it was a step forward, a way to honor both my values and my boundaries. And in the end, that was enough for me. In the weeks and months that followed, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. My dad's treatments continued, and his health showed slow, cautious improvement. I did what I could to support him from a distance. Occasional phone calls to check in, polite but brief conversations that rarely scratched beneath the surface. Our relationship remained strained, the gaps in our connection too wide to bridge completely. I told myself I'd made peace with it, but the truth was more complicated. There were days when I wondered if I'd made the right decision by helping him. Had I been too generous? Too soft? Or had I done just enough to balance compassion with self-respect? The questions looped in my mind like a broken record, each one harder to answer than the last. The hardest part wasn't the lingering doubt or the financial cost. It was the realization that the relationship I had once hoped for with my dad might never exist. The trust we'd lost over the years couldn't simply be rebuilt with a few conversations or half-hearted apologies. It required effort, honesty, and vulnerability, things my dad had never been good at giving. One afternoon, as I was reorganizing some old boxes in the attic, I came across a photo album from my childhood. Flipping through its pages, I found a picture of my dad and me at a park. I couldn't have been more than 7, my face painted with a sloppy butterfly design, and he was grinning ear to ear as he helped me balance on a seesaw. For a moment, I let myself linger in that memory, the version of him in the photograph, so different from the man I knew now. Back then, I had believed he could do no wrong, that he would always be there for me. The photo felt like a snapshot of a dream, something beautiful but fleeting, impossible to recapture. It hit me then that part of my struggle with him wasn't just about his absence or his failures. It was about letting go of the version of him I had once idolized, the father I had wanted him to be, but who had never truly existed. As I stared at the photo, I realized something else. Holding on to that idealized version of him was only hurting me. It was keeping me tied to a cycle of disappointment, always hoping for a moment of clarity or redemption that might never come. I placed the photo back in the album, closed the cover, and let out a deep breath. For the first time, I felt a sense of clarity, a quiet acceptance of who my dad was and, more importantly, who he wasn't. From that moment on, I stopped trying to force our relationship into something it couldn't be. I stopped expecting him to change in ways he wasn't capable of and started focusing on the relationships that truly mattered, the ones that brought me joy, love, and mutual respect. Luke was my greatest source of strength during this time, always reminding me of my worth when doubt crept in. "You've done more than enough," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "You've set boundaries, you've helped him when he needed it, and you've protected yourself in the process. That's not easy, but you did it. Be proud of that." His words stayed with me, becoming a mantra I returned to whenever guilt or second-guessing tried to take hold. Over time, I found myself leaning more into the family I had chosen, friends who felt like siblings, colleagues who celebrated my successes, and Luke, who had shown me what unconditional love really looked like. They became my anchors, the people who reminded me that family wasn't just about blood ties, but about the connections we nurture and the people who show up for us when it matters most. As for my dad, our relationship remained a distant, functional connection. I continued to check in on him periodically, sending him cards on his birthday or during the holidays. He seemed grateful, though he never made any real effort to deepen our conversations or address the underlying issues between us. I stopped expecting more from him, and in doing so, I found a surprising sense of peace. Letting go of those expectations didn't mean I loved him any less. It simply meant I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own well-being for a relationship that would never live up to what I had once imagined. Looking back, I realized that his actions had taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes, family is who you choose, not who you're born into. Blood doesn't give anyone the right to take you for granted, to dismiss your feelings, or to hurt you without consequence. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't change my dad, but I could change how I chose to move forward, with boundaries, self-respect, and a newfound understanding of my own worth. One day, as I was sitting in the park with Luke, watching children play on the swings and families picnic under the trees, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. Life wasn't perfect, and my relationship with my dad would always be complicated. But I had found my own version of happiness, built on a foundation of love, resilience, and the lessons I had learned along the way. And that, I realized, was more than enough.